The longships that appeared on England's shores represented not just a technological marvel, but a completely different philosophy of warfare. While Saxon forces were accustomed to engaging enemies who announced their intentions through formal declarations or visible army movements, the Vikings operated with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries. The psychological advantage this created cannot be overstated. For coastal communities throughout England, the constant anxiety of potential raids transformed daily life. Watchtowers were constructed, liturgical treasures buried, and contingency plans developed for rapid evacuation. The Norse warriors themselves were products of a society that valued individual combat skills from an early age. The sagas tell us that young men were expected to demonstrate proficiency with weapons, physical strength, and tactical acumen. Unlike the more hierarchical Saxon military structure, Viking warbands functioned as meritocracies, where leadership was earned through demonstrated ability rather than solely through birth. This created a remarkably adaptable command structure where innovative tactics could emerge from any rank. When a Viking leader proved ineffective, his followers might simply transfer their allegiance to a more successful commander, creating natural selection pressure that rewarded tactical innovation. The weapons and armor of the Norse raiders reflected pragmatic efficiency rather than status displays. While Saxon elites might wear elaborate helmets and mail shirts as symbols of their rank, Viking warriors typically traveled light, prioritizing mobility over heavy protection. Their primary defensive equipment was the round shield, often painted with distinctive designs, and many wore leather armor reinforced with metal plates rather than complete mail shirts. The versatile hand axe served as both weapon and tool, while the feared Viking sword, often pattern-welded with complex designs in the steel, represented the height of early medieval metallurgy. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Repton, where the great heathen army wintered in 873-874, have revealed the variety of weapons in Viking arsenals, from broad-bladed spears to compact bows, suitable for use from ships. The stark difference in military philosophy became evident in the pattern of early Viking successes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 835, heathen men ravaged Sheppey. By 851, the scale had escalated dramatically. The heathen men remained over winter at Thanet, and that same year came 350 ships to the mouth of the Thames, and they stormed Canterbury and London and put to flight Beorhtwulf, king of the Mercians. The progression from isolated raids to coordinated campaigns demonstrates how quickly the Norse adapted their tactics to exploit Saxon vulnerabilities. Perhaps the most devastating advantage the Vikings possessed was their operational tempo. While Saxon forces moved at the pace of marching infantry, constrained by the need to maintain supply lines and muster points, Viking raiders could strike without warning, withdraw before counterattacks could be organized, and reappear at entirely different locations days later. This operational mobility meant that defensive forces had to be spread thin along extensive coastlines and river systems, creating inevitable gaps that Norse scouts quickly identified and exploited. The psychological impact extended beyond military circles to reshape Anglo-Saxon society itself. Communities began relocating away from vulnerable coastal areas and navigable rivers, reversing settlement patterns that had existed for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that some coastal trading centers declined sharply during this period, while more defensible inland locations saw rapid growth. The very geography of English settlement was being redrawn in response to the Norse threat. For Saxon kings, the Viking incursions created not only military challenges but political ones. Their legitimacy rested partly on their ability to protect their subjects, and repeated Norse successes undermined royal authority. This crisis of confidence contributed to political realignments as weaker kingdoms sought protection from stronger neighbors, accelerating the consolidation process that would eventually produce a unified England. King Alfred's successful resistance to Viking expansion became the foundation for West Saxon dominance, and ultimately the creation of a single English kingdom under his descendants. The economic dimensions of the Viking impact were equally profound. The raiders targeted stores of precious metals, particularly silver, which existed in significant quantities at wealthy religious institutions. This redistribution of wealth from static church treasuries to dynamic trading networks had far-reaching consequences. Norse merchants established new commercial centers at locations like Jorvik, York, Dublin, and Waterford, integrating the British Isles more firmly into Baltic and North Sea trading systems. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of workshops producing goods specifically for export markets, suggesting sophisticated economic planning beyond mere raiding. Silver hoards buried during this period tell a complex story of wealth circulation. Coins from as far away as the Islamic Caliphate have been found alongside Anglo-Saxon currency and Norse jewelry in these emergency deposits, revealing the extensive trade networks that connected seemingly distant regions. The Vikings served as both disruptors and connectors in the economic landscape of early medieval Europe, simultaneously devastating local economies through raiding while establishing new commercial linkages through trade. The religious dimension of the Viking-Saxon collision resonated deeply in contemporary accounts. For Christian chroniclers, the pagan Norse represented an existential threat to a religious order that had been established over centuries. The deliberate targeting of monasteries was interpreted not merely as economic opportunism, but as a spiritual assault. When Vikings desecrated Christian sites or melted down sacred objects for their silver content, they committed what Anglo-Saxon sources described as sacrilege, attacks on the divine order itself. Yet even in this religious conflict, complexity emerged over time. Archaeological evidence from Viking burials in England shows gradual cultural hybridization, with Norse paganism and Christianity existing in uneasy proximity. Grave goods reveal individuals buried with both Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses, suggesting a pragmatic approach to spiritual matters. As Norse settlers established permanent communities, many converted to Christianity, sometimes maintaining aspects of their traditional beliefs within nominally Christian practice, a syncretic approach that horrified Orthodox Church authorities but represented a practical adaptation to new circumstances. The scholarly world suffered particular devastation during the early raids. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were not merely religious institutions but centers of learning and manuscript production. The loss of irreplaceable texts and the disruption of educational systems created intellectual gaps that would take generations to fill. When Viking raiders burned libraries or scattered monastic communities, they unwittingly destroyed knowledge repositories that had preserved classical learning through the darkest periods after Rome's fall. The great monastery at Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had produced his monumental ecclesiastical history of the English people a century earlier, was repeatedly targeted, its scholarly traditions severely disrupted. Yet even here, the story contains paradoxical elements. As Norse settlements became established, particularly in areas like the Danelaw, new cultural exchanges became possible. Viking traders maintained connections with Byzantine and Islamic civilizations, potentially introducing texts and ideas that had been lost to Western Europe. The Norse emphasis on oral tradition and memorized poetry, their skalds could recite thousands of lines from memory, preserved their own cultural knowledge without requiring written records, demonstrating an alternative approach to cultural transmission that both contrasted with and eventually complemented Saxon literary traditions. The linguistic impact of the Norse influx permanently altered the English language. Old English and Old Norse were related Germanic languages with sufficient similarities to allow basic communication, but prolonged contact in the Danelaw region produced significant vocabulary, borrowing, and grammatical influence. Everyday words like sky, egg, knife, law, window, and hundreds more entered English from Norse sources. More fundamentally, the simplification of English grammatical forms The reduction of complex Old English gender and case systems may have been accelerated by Norse-English linguistic contact, as speakers of related but distinct languages developed simplified forms for mutual comprehension. Place names across northern and eastern England still bear witness to this Norse influence. Settlements with names ending in "-by", Grimsby, Whitby, Thorpe, Scunthorpe, or Thwaite, Braithwaite, mark areas of dense Viking settlement. These linguistic fossils allow modern historians to map the extent and intensity of Norse colonization with remarkable precision, revealing patterns of settlement that archaeological evidence alone might miss. The density of Scandinavian place names decreases gradually from north to south, confirming historical accounts of the Danelaw's extent. As the initial shock of Viking raids gave way to a more complex relationship of conflict, coexistence, and eventual integration, new political structures emerged. The Danelaw operated under legal customs distinct from those in Saxon-controlled regions, with different inheritance patterns, land divisions, and judicial procedures. Archaeological excavations at sites like Jorvik reveal urban planning influenced by Scandinavian models, with distinctive long, narrow property plots and specialized craft areas. Even after the Danelaw came under English royal control, these regional differences persisted in law and custom. The military innovations that emerged from this period transformed European warfare. The Viking emphasis on naval power and mobility eventually influenced Saxon military organization under kings like Alfred, who created England's first standing navy specifically to counter Norse seaborne threats. Coastal defense networks, signal systems, and rapid response forces developed in reaction to Viking tactics would become standard elements of medieval military planning throughout Europe. The concept of the professional warrior, maintained year-round rather than called up for specific campaigns, gained prominence, accelerating the development of the knightly class that would dominate European battlefields for centuries to come. Trading patterns established during the Viking Age created new commercial networks that outlasted the period of conflict. Scandinavian merchants established regular routes connecting the British Isles to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, expanding the known world for European civilization. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements shows the impressive range of goods in circulation: Baltic amber, Russian furs, Byzantine silks, and Islamic silver moved along routes pioneered by Viking traders. These commercial connections fostered cultural exchange alongside economic activity, with artistic styles, technological innovations, and religious ideas traveling alongside material goods. The material culture that developed in Viking-influenced regions reflected this fusion of traditions. Distinctive art styles emerged, combining elements of Norse animal interlace with Saxon and Celtic motifs. The ringerike and urn styles that flourished in the late Viking Age show this cultural hybridization with sinuous animal forms and plant ornament, creating designs that were neither purely Scandinavian nor Anglo-Saxon, but something new and distinctive. Artifacts from this period, jewelry, weapons, carved stone monuments, demonstrate how creative cultural exchange could emerge even from violent initial contact. For the ordinary people living through these transformative events, daily life adapted to new realities. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements shows changes in building styles, agricultural practices, and domestic arrangements as Saxon and Norse traditions intermingled. Excavations at sites like Cottam in Yorkshire reveal farmsteads where Anglo-Saxon structural elements exist alongside Scandinavian-influenced artifacts, suggesting households where cultural boundaries blurred through intermarriage and practical cooperation. The very rhythms of rural life, seasonal festivities, naming practices, inheritance customs, incorporated elements from both traditions. The fate of the Saxon warrior class in this changing landscape varied by region and circumstance. In areas of heavy Norse settlement, some Saxon military leaders adapted by adopting elements of Viking fighting styles and organizational methods, essentially becoming indistinguishable from their former adversaries. Others found their social position diminished as Norse jarls established new power centers with their own military retinues. In regions that remained under Saxon control, warriors incorporated lessons learned from facing Viking opponents, becoming more mobile and responsive, less tied to traditional battlefield formations. By the early 11th century, the distinction between Viking and Saxon had begun to blur in many regions. Canute the Great, who ruled England from 1016 to 1035, represented this new reality, a Danish king who governed according to English customs while maintaining Scandinavian connections. His empire, spanning England, Denmark, and Norway, represented the culmination of the Norse impact on British politics, creating a North Sea power bloc that temporarily united regions that had been in conflict for generations. Under his rule, former enemies served in the same royal administration, and legal systems incorporated elements from both traditions. The cultural memory of the Viking Age persisted long after the actual conflicts ended. In English folklore and literature, the Norse raiders remained potent symbols of foreign threat, periodically re-invoked during later crises. Medieval chroniclers looking back at this period often simplified its complexity, casting it as a straightforward conflict between Christian civilization and pagan barbarism rather than the nuanced cultural exchange it actually represented. This simplified narrative served political purposes, allowing later English kings to portray themselves as defenders against external threats, but it obscured the degree to which English identity itself had been shaped by Norse influence. In Scandinavia, a parallel process of historical myth-making occurred. The Viking Age became romanticized in later medieval literature as a golden age of heroic adventure, with the sagas celebrating the exploits of raiders and explorers. These narratives, composed centuries after the events they described, reveal more about how later generations wished to remember their ancestors than about the historical realities of the period. They emphasize individual heroism and adventure while downplaying the economic motivations and practical considerations that drove much of the Viking expansion. Archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding of this transformative era. Recent excavations at sites like Repton have revealed Viking winter camps with extensive defenses and evidence of large forces, confirming chronicle accounts previously dismissed as exaggerated. DNA studies of skeletal remains from Viking burials in England suggest substantial female Norse settlement alongside male warriors, indicating family migration rather than solely military occupation. Underwater archaeology has recovered remarkably preserved ship timbers, allowing more accurate reconstructions of the vessels that made the Norse expansion possible. Modern scanning technologies applied to previously excavated hoards have revealed details invisible to earlier archaeologists, makers' marks on silver items, inscriptions worn too faint for the naked eye, and production techniques that demonstrate sophisticated craftsmanship. Environmental archaeology, examining pollen records and soil samples, provides insights into how landscape use changed during this period, with shifts in agricultural practices and settlement patterns visible in the microscopic record of the land itself. The legacy of the Viking-Saxon interaction extends far beyond Britain's shores. Norse expansion reached from North America to the Russian river systems, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. Everywhere they went, similar patterns emerged, initial conflict giving way to settlement, trade, and eventual cultural fusion. The Rus, who gave their name to Russia, the Normans, who conquered England in 1066 and Sicily thereafter, the Norse colonies in Greenland, and brief settlements in North America, all represented branches of this extraordinary diaspora that reshaped medieval Europe. The technological innovations that enabled Viking mobility continued to influence shipbuilding for centuries. Naval architects studying Norse vessel designs note their remarkable efficiency and seaworthiness, achieved without the mathematical calculations available to modern engineers. The principles of clinker construction, overlapping hull planks that create both strength and flexibility, remained standard in northern European shipbuilding until the late medieval period. The sail rigs and steering systems developed by Norse shipwrights represented solutions to maritime challenges that would not be significantly improved upon until the age of scientific navigation. As we reflect on how Viking raiders made Saxon warriors obsolete, in the span of a single generation, we recognize a pattern repeated throughout history. Established military systems suddenly rendered ineffective by innovative challengers who refused to follow conventional rules of engagement. The Saxon warrior, trained for set-piece battles against familiar opponents, faced adversaries who attacked from unexpected directions, refused to engage except on favorable terms, and vanished before effective countermeasures could be implemented. This asymmetric advantage persisted until defensive systems evolved sufficiently to counter it, a process that took decades and required fundamental rethinking of military organization. The interaction between Vikings and Saxons represents one of history's most consequential cultural exchanges, transforming both societies through conflict and coexistence, from language to law, from art to architecture, from military tactics to trade networks. The fusion of Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements created something distinct from either parent culture, a hybrid civilization that would ultimately influence the development of modern England. What began with the shock of unprecedented raids evolved into one of medieval Europe's most dynamic cultural frontiers, demonstrating humanity's remarkable capacity to move from conflict to cooperation, from fear to familiarity. Today, as archaeologists continue to unearth new evidence and historians reinterpret primary sources, our understanding of this complex period continues to evolve. The simple narrative of marauding Vikings and victimized Saxons has given way to a more nuanced appreciation of the commercial, political, and cultural dimensions of Norse expansion. We now recognize that the impact of these northern warriors extended far beyond battlefield tactics to reshape the very foundations of English society, leaving an enduring legacy visible in everything from our vocabulary to our legal traditions. The shores that once watched anxiously for dragon-proud ships now welcome tourists, fascinated by this dramatic chapter of European history. Museum exhibits display the artifacts of both Norse and Saxon cultures. Archaeological sites preserve the physical evidence of their interaction, and historical reconstructions bring to life the technological innovations that made the Viking expansion possible. What was once a terrifying disruption to established order has become a source of cultural pride and historical fascination, a testament to how completely former adversaries can be integrated into shared historical narratives. And so the legacy of those first shocking raids, when Saxon warriors found their world transformed overnight by adversaries they could scarcely comprehend, continues to resonate through time. In studying this pivotal moment, we gain insight not only into a specific historical transition, but into the broader patterns of cultural collision, technological disruption, and eventual synthesis that have shaped human civilization throughout recorded time. The Vikings and Saxons have long since departed the stage of history, but the world they collectively created through conflict, compromise, and coexistence remains very much with us today.